Welcome to Leaders in the Arena. My name is Jenny Whitener, and I am the CEO of Bridge Innovate. For over 20 years, Bridge Innovate has partnered with leaders to solve problems and simultaneously build leadership capabilities. It's kind of a two-for-one thing. This series, Leaders in the Arena, is designed to share valuable insights and lessons from our clients and our network as inspiration for other leaders in the arena. At Bridge Innovate, we focus on empowering teams to lead, think, and problem solve differently. A lot of our clients come to us for consulting services, our Future Lab design sprints, or maybe they need a customized leadership program or team development next generation session. And some of our clients just come to the great studio that you see behind me to run their own meetings. Today, I'm so excited to share with you and thank our special guest today, Glenda Hicks. She's a Bridge Innovate consultant and thought leader in the nonprofit sector. We're just so thrilled that she's here with us today to talk about unlocking the power of nonprofit boards. Glenda has 20 plus years of consulting experience in leadership, strategy, and innovation, working with senior teams all across the country, focused on capacity building and organizational improvement. She's a certified coach and facilitator. And best of all, she's a CPA. And I always talk about that with her. She has over 10 years of experience in working with the Bridge Innovate team, working in a number of our different solution sets, running design sprints, running speed and agility sprints, and also helping us to manage our strategic relationship with Morehouse College out of Atlanta. Glenda, welcome to today's program. We're so glad that you're here.
Thank you so much, Jenny. I am excited to be here with you today to spend some time talking about the importance and the value of nonprofit boards, coming to you from Metro Atlanta. And so just excited to have this conversation and help our listeners to strengthen their organizations.
Great. And I also want to say that some of our listeners are joining us live today for our session. And if you are, I just invite you to introduce yourselves to each other using the chat. And also, if you have questions throughout the day's program, please post them in the chat. If we don't get to them throughout the program, Glenda and I will try to make our time work so that we get to those by the end of today's session. So, all right, let's get going. Nonprofit boards, unlocking nonprofit boards. Glenda, let's start at the beginning. What is the foundational role of boards and nonprofit governance and decision-making? Let's kind of just start with that foundation.
Absolutely. At the foundation, nonprofit governance boards are charged with leading the organization. They are the strategic visionaries. They are the holder of the mission. And it's their responsibility to ensure that the organization engages in activities that align with that mission and keep them true to why they started the organization in the first place. But the buck stops with them as well. They really hold the legal responsibility to be accountable to their stakeholders, to comply with regulations and laws, and in particular, their own bylaws. Being familiar with what's in that originating document and their articles of incorporation that define who they are, why they exist, what are the responsibilities of their officers and their directors, and really maintaining that strategic vision, really looking at where are we going in the future and leaving that day-to-day operations and management, ideally to a compensated staff that is, being led by their chief executive. So they're really looking at that 30,000-foot perspective of where are we going and how we're going to get there, and do we have the funding and the capacity to make it happen? And so there's a lot of responsibility at that board level to just ensure that the organization is doing what it said it would do.
Right, right. So you talk about that. I mean, I know that some of the boards, when you and I have done strategic planning with nonprofit boards together, I know that there's some boards that go beyond governance and strategic decision making because some of them are kind of working boards.
Yes.
Go on to the next question. Can you talk a little bit about that and like what you see in the arena when boards are small enough or nonprofits are so small that they always seem to have governance and strategic decision making, but some boards have that little bit more where they're actually a working board. Talk to us about that differentiation, and then we'll go on to the next question.
Absolutely. The reality is the majority of the nonprofit organizations in our country are small. The majority of them have budgets of $500,000 or less. And like all likelihood, they're more around a couple 100,000 in all actuality. And what that means is they're not able to bring on these big compensated staff teams. And the board does find themselves rolling up their sleeves and doing a lot of the work, especially in the beginning when they're new and they're in their infancy. But even as they go through their various stages of growth and development, that growth does not necessarily include expanding their staff because of the resources that they have. And so they do find themselves where the board is rolling up their sleeves and getting involved in what's traditionally day to day. A lot of times that finance function, you talk about CPA, is the first area where they're leaning in. That treasurer might be the one maintaining the books. Technically, they have the responsibility, but often they're able to task a staff person with that. But when they're smaller, that treasurer is doing the work. And
Right.
so they're administering the programs a lot of times to get everything ramped up, if you will, to the size and scale that they see the need for in the community. Not growing just for the sake of growing, but because the need is there and the demand is there. And until they get to that point, the board is in the weeds.
Right.
So
I know in some of the work we've done together, I've seen some boards when they're assessing what's the next board role, or do we have another board position, and what skill set do we need from that person? A lot of times I'll take that into consideration. Do we need more help in development,
yes,
fundraising or whatever? So they may look to recruit a board member that comes in that working capacity and some special capability that they're missing. So great. All right. So fundamentally, what we've talked about is this role ultimately for boards with governance, strategic decision making, sort of outlined in the bylaws, and it could expand a little bit beyond that, especially if you're a smaller nonprofit. Talk
mm-hmm.
now about some misconceptions, because a lot of professionals today, they see that as an important part, their professional role maybe in the for-profit sector, but the way they give back in their nonprofit board service or commitment. So talk about some misconceptions about board service.
Well, some of the misconceptions are that if there is a staff, that they'll handle everything. So the first misconception is that board members sometimes don't prioritize that service on the board, and they may or may not show up at a meeting. If they show up at the meeting, they may not contribute that talent that they were brought on to provide in terms of speaking up and joining the conversation and asking questions, because they really feel like that their CEO, their chief executive, the executive director, whatever title they're using, will carry the ball and make sure everything is handled. And that's not an even balance in that partnership between the board and the chief executive. And so there's this misconception that everything will just take place, it'll happen, we'll be okay. And they have this low prioritization. But the reality is, going back to that first question, they have that legal responsibility and they're running a corporation. I think so many people aspire to own a business and be an entrepreneur, but if you're serving on a board, you're already running a business at that strategic level. You're responsible for the corporate decisions and how they're then passed on to the chief executive to carry out. So there's this misconception around the value that you bring and the true necessity of your presence and your thought leadership and the skill sets that you have that you were intentionally sought when someone invited you to join the board. So you're bringing that legal perspective, you're bringing that IT perspective, that public relations and communication, so that you can make these decisions and critical junctures in time, such as right now. Nonprofits are always front and center when big things happen in our economy. I hearken back to the real estate bust in '08.
Yeah.
And then we had the pandemic, and now we have new administration. And the nonprofit entity is always out in front, feeling that impact. Their service demand increases, and a lot of times their funding doesn't. And so that board needs to be that thought leadership. And you're bringing your skills from your day job that you've been trained on to be able to provide it to this nonprofit corporation to ensure its continued existence. So I would say those are some of the top misconceptions that I think people carry with them when they come to organizations.
Right. So it's really almost bring your whole self, right? So you
Absolutely.
might be engaged in the nonprofit sector if you're working for profit, because of your heart, or your commitment or your ethics or, just an aspiration you have personally. But what I'm hearing you say is bring all that capability with you, all your professional experience, all your expertise, bring that to your board service.
Yes.
Thinking about that, many times when boards add board members, one of the most difficult parts is getting that level of engagement, getting that individual to where they're really performing. I can remember serving on some boards, and it felt like the new board members were like quiet, like somebody had their lips zipped for the first year. And I think they were just trying to figure out who's on first. Well, how does this work? So talk about if you're encouraging board chairs and board leaders to, when they're bringing on new board members, to get them to bring their whole self to that nonprofit leadership. How do you do that? What's training look like? How do you onboard them? How's that look?
Well, it's very critical and significant in that process. I'm glad you asked that because that is an area where I see a lot of organizations fall short for a variety of reasons. But it's very important to onboard them intentionally, that you bring on new board members in a way that you ideally maybe pair them with a seasoned, experienced board member who may be in their second term and has great familiarity with the culture and the processes and practices and the bylaws, and can walk hand in hand with that new person to be their go-to resource for questions they have if they feel intimidated in those early meetings. But it's also about having a formal orientation where you literally have a presentation and engagement with the new folks, and you provide a slide deck of information. You provide a binder or virtual binder where they can go to with the resources that they need in terms of prior minutes, financial statements, descriptions of your programs, org chart of who's who and how to contact them on the board level, and then an org chart of who's who in the organization. So you get to know who's doing the work, and showing videos, providing a tour of your facilities if you happen to have office space or programmatic space, but really intentionally meeting with these new folks in a group setting so they get to know each other as a new cohort, but also they get to know who's on the board currently and create relationship and start introducing themselves and working side by side and getting to know who's who and what's going on, and bringing in staff to make presentations so you get to hear what their day in the life is like in terms of delivering on your mission and providing services. And it's an ongoing process. It doesn't stop with that onboarding. It continues throughout the service where you have little intentional training moments. You bring in consultants and trainers, and you have time on your agenda to do a training segment that could be 10 minutes long, and just fit it into that hour to 90 minutes that you're having a regularly scheduled board meeting. And that's what helps folks to feel comfortable in areas where they don't have a strength. You might not have a strong understanding of accounting and finances and numbers, but if you bring in your folks or your treasurer, give them time on the agenda to do a mini training outside of the regular report, then people start acclimating and strengthening their skill set and feeling more confident and understanding what questions they need to ask.
Right, I can see that. Just in hearing you talk about this nonprofit board service, the word leadership, and you talked about that, the word leadership keeps coming to mind. And in the for-profit sector, when we talk about leadership, we would never think about not continuing to develop them.
Right.
That's
Yes.
always like leadership development for most organizations. If you don't have an internal department, maybe you send someone off to a conference, you send them to a program or what have you. And that's just a common thing that we think about in terms of continuing to build leadership. And I think today, when you've helped us think through the role of the board and bringing your whole self there, you're really a part of the leadership capability of this nonprofit, and this additional training that you're talking about is really a key part of maturing that leadership at the board level. Tell me a little bit. I know that I've seen you do this with some of your clients. We talk about board self-assessments.
Mm-hmm.
Get into that part a little bit. Is that uncomfortable for some boards or some board members when they go through assessment? Training's one thing, right? Learn, right? But if I have to turn the mirror on myself and reflect back, am I being the best board member I can be, or how is our overall board performance? Talk a little bit about the assessment component.
Absolutely. Assessments are critical. They're very important for helping us to see where we are, how we're doing, and where we need to go. And it's true of a board as well. They need to assess themselves as a collective and then also individually. And we've worked with organizations where that hasn't been something that they've done on a regular basis. They haven't built it into their practices. And it's so helpful to step back and just look at how you're performing. Are you working with synergy? Do you understand the programs in a way that you feel like you can speak to them effectively in the community? Are you comfortable and confident with helping to raise funds for the organization by connecting the chief executive to your spheres of influence? Learning whether or not you're doing that and doing it effectively and what it looks like and how it best practices suggest you might do that is what you begin to reveal when you engage in a self-assessment. And, when people give you feedback, we talk about that being a blessing when we do our leadership development trainings together, because they've given you insight into things that you may not see from your own perspective. And that's what an assessment does for you. It gives you this objective opportunity to answer a series of questions, provide some open comments, and really get a temperature of how everyone is feeling, doing, perceiving, performing, and what's not working. And then from there, you have the data and you can start to build an action plan that says we're going to prioritize these areas for improvement. And that gives the board an opportunity to manage itself better, because really there's only two things the board manages: itself and the chief executive.
Yeah.
So how they determine the best way to do their work can be driven very effectively by these self-assessments. And so if you look at it also at the individual level, it gives the organization an opportunity to check in individually with each director to see, how's this working for you? What committee would you like to be a part of? Let's talk about your personal contribution financially and professionally in terms of your skill set. And do you feel like you're able to contribute the way you had hoped to when we asked you to join?
Yeah.
So it's very critical to pause periodically and do these assessments.
I love how you're talking about that. We connect leadership development with assessment of our leadership capabilities and where we need to grow, and how we could use that same mental model with our boards.
Mm-hmm.
And it also makes me think that boards, when they're onboarding their board members, the importance of setting clear expectations. So if I'm going to do self-assessment or assessment as a collective, as a board, against what goal?
Mm-hmm.
To what end? And so I think your part about the onboarding and the training is clear about, here are the expectations of the board at the board level. If you're on a committee, here's how we'd like to see you contribute. Here's kind of setting some expectations of your contribution, so that when you do assessment, it's just not there you're sitting up and taking nourishment. Did you actually contribute against the goal that you set for yourself? So great feedback. When we think about performance with the board, many times people will say, well, the culture gets in the way, or the culture actually helps us because of the way we engage our board. Talk a little bit about how this culture piece plays into board performance, where we see things like collaboration, accountability, all that come into play. How does culture play into board performance?
Great question. And so powerful and true. And it's a lot of what we see is culture being a factor in performance from the perspective of, what do you allow individual board members to get away with? That's really what we're talking about. Because if you don't hold each other accountable, then people will begin to do what you let them do. And that comes back to attending meetings. Do you have a culture where you allow people to miss repeated meetings and then you don't do anything about it? And granted, there are reasons people miss. And so if you go back to your bylaws, typically it's defined in there what actions a board can take if there's repeated absences that have not been explained. And so if you don't take that action, then you're setting a culture that says it's okay not to show up. And that's where people begin to believe one of those misconceptions, that I don't have to be there. But if you're not there, there may not be a quorum. And if there's no quorum, there's no action. Boards can't do anything without a quorum except have a chit chat. We can talk about a lot of things, but we can't make a motion and vote on it if you're not there. And so the culture is very important. Another example is, again, stepping forward, stepping back. There's all these personalities around the table, and those personalities change. You have terms that are expiring. So you and I have done work on team building, on doing things with speed and agility. We've talked about the concept of forming, storming, norming, and performing, and how you get teams to gel quickly. Boards have to do that repeatedly because of the turnover. And so if you have this culture where you're not really engaging people, bringing them in, helping them to feel comfortable and confident, communicating with one another, having these social encounters where it's not just about business when we walk in the door, but that we know the other person to a point where you don't want to let them down. So you're creating this team spirit, you're creating this accountability, you're perhaps even using a dashboard that has some key metrics of attendance, of giving, not necessarily by individual name, but you can see to what percentage the board has made personal contributions.
Love that.
Your strategic plan goals on there, and you get a snapshot of how well you're tracking with that. So all of this, these behaviors, these actions, these practices, that defines the culture. And so the stronger that culture is, the more effective the board is in working together and making decisions and really bringing their whole self, as you said earlier, to the conversation and giving each person an opportunity to be vulnerable, because it needs to be a safe space. It needs to be an attack of the issue and not of the person. And people need to feel like they can speak up and have a contrary opinion, because that's where you get the best results, is when you dig in and you converse and you deliberate and you have some contrary opinions that help you get to the root of the issue so that you can make those strategic decisions in the best way with the best information that you have at that time.
Great feedback. You know, we have one of our live guests today joining us on this session. It's indicates that they are starting a nonprofit. So in all the guidance that you've shared today in terms of, you know, getting clear on the role of the board and some common misperceptions and training and even performance just now for board members, any particular guidance that you would have for folks who are starting a nonprofit, or, you know, any special guidance around establishing the board?
Absolutely. I think the biggest takeaway with starting a nonprofit is to get the right people around you quickly. A lot of times when nonprofits start and they apply for that tax exemption status and you need those 3 folks on the board, you reach out to the people that are closest to you, that see your vision, which makes sense, but sometimes they're also family members or people that don't have strong skill sets in business. We have to remember that the nonprofit is a business, even though we're in it for the passion. And so you're getting warm bodies, if you will. And a lot of times they cannot lean in and really help you structure the organization in the best way. So be intentional about who you ask to join your board as you're starting that founding group of individuals who are really going to lay the foundation for who you are and how you move forward, would be my first recommendation. And then get an accountant in there. So you don't have to worry about the books and the grants that you're trying to get and manage them.
Bring in a board member with that skill set. I love it. You know, another one of our live guests, Dan, has got a question in here. It says, what's the role of the executive director, CEO, versus the role of the board chair to foster the kind of healthy conflict that you talked about, the healthy conflict environment? Talk about whose role is that, or how do they team up on that to bring in?
Thank you for that question. Yes, that is definitely a complicated area for many, maintaining what we like to call the board staff partnership. And it's a partnership between that board chair and the chief executive specifically, but also the larger board as a whole as well. But having that working relationship where you're meeting regularly, ideally some sort of communication, at least weekly or bi-weekly, even if it's a text or a phone call, not necessarily a formal meeting, but staying in close communication And there are times when the chair will lead, there's times when the executive will lead, and there's times when you co-lead. And that really is in every area of responsibility, and it's a matter of defining who does what when. But the chair is primarily tasked with leading the board. You're the steward of the board, and the chair ensures that the board is doing its job, pulling its weight, and making decisions and fulfilling its responsibilities. And so it's really like an air traffic controller, if you will, or a traffic cop who's making sure that they're directing the members in a way that things get done.
Mhm.
And the chief executive has that internal operations perspective, making sure whatever the board puts forth, the staff accomplishes. So they're implementing those policies, they're managing the day to day, they're dealing with the situation and the crises, and they're keeping the board informed and aware so that the
Mhm.
board knows what they should focus on, what they should have conversations around, who they should be meeting with in the community to advocate on behalf of their organization and informing different entities
Mhm.
about the work of the organization and the impact different decisions have on the nonprofit sector as a whole.
Mhm.
So I hope that's helpful to give you that sense of how they work together, but how they have a distinct responsibility to either the board or the
Mhm.
internal team of leaders and staff.
Right. And I like what how clearly you laid out the accountability of the board chair. They are the steward of the board. And, one of the things that I think about in terms of just norms of teams, right? They are a team as a board, and how they team with executive director is part of that teaming structure. And what
Yes.
I've seen, and I know you and I have worked with teams on this and other projects, is that first you could have what are our values or what are our aspirations, a private conversation almost between the board chair and the executive director. How do we ensure that we can have candid talk? Because through
Mm-hmm.
candid talk and open and honest conversation, where we address situations and not attack people, so that's a distinction, we actually get the best ideas on the table in order to have our best outcome. And so if there's agreement there between those two people that when things are called into question, it's out of the commitment of great performance or outstanding outcomes that we're questioning things or bringing new ideas to the table versus it being personal. So get that agreement up front early on and then talk about it at the board level. What norms or what tactics do we want to use to have candid conversation and talk about the importance? I know in our leadership programs, we have this, what we call SBI model. What was the situation? What was the behavior? What was
Mm-hmm.
the impact? So it's not like, Jenny, I didn't like the red scarf today. It's not a personal thing. It was like, here was a situation, we went through this, and we really needed you to bring additional contacts to our business development effort. And we didn't see any coming in from you, and that's really going to impact our ability to raise the funds we need. That was the impact. So I think having some conflict norms and structure can also, the clarity of role, as you said, and kind of some preset norms of how they deal with that can also know that people, this is how we do it here.
Yes,
We start
absolutely.
with ideas. We attack ideas and we attack issues, not people.
Well said. Absolutely. I echo that 100%.
Yeah. All right. So
So,
I know there is some wrap up material that you wanted to share. Should we do that now?
yes, if you just jump to a slide, I like to share this because I think it brings it all together. This is one of the resources I use through my board source affiliation, which is a national capacity building nonprofit leader, and in the space of governance in particular. And it just kind of shows the stages that boards run through, where your board might be dysfunctional and there's dramatic disengagement, there's conflict, like you just said, if there's no rules of engagement laid out and shared, then you have this dysfunction where you can't get things done and move the agenda forward. But you advance to a functional state where you can check the boxes. We did this, we had a meeting, we took minutes, we did a vote, but there's not real engagement. And that's where you cross the line, so to speak, from this sort of disengaged, unconscious leadership style into more conscious behaviors and intentional behaviors, where now you're really concerned about responsible leadership and being compliant and ensuring that you've not just checked the boxes, but you've discussed some things and you've ensured that you have what you need and you're moving the agency forward. And that highest level is exceptional. And this is where you're looking at the future, you're being very strategic, and you're embracing all of yourself and each one's skill sets, and you're dealing with true existential issues that are facing your organization. And so we like to find where the board is at any point in time and help them by walking alongside them to get to that exceptional point. And you will move in and out of these boxes depending on the time, the situation, or the crisis that may be occurring. Boards tend to rise to that exceptional level when there's a lot of things going on in our community, and such as the pandemic.
Right.
Exceptional service that got us through that. So
Good.
just wanted to wrap up with that visual of all the content that we were able to cover today.
Well, and Glenda, thank you so much. A great insight on nonprofit board performance. And I just remind all of our participants today, you can find Glenda on LinkedIn at Glenda Hicks. You can also find her email on the Bridge Innovate website under our consulting team. So we are so thankful for Glenda and her leadership. We've had an opportunity at Bridge to work with a number of nonprofit clients. And we also want to thank our nonprofit leaders and boards for the amazing work that they do in our community. Something to think about other programs coming up at Bridge Innovate. We do have Experience Innovation Change. If you're having difficulty designing and implementing an effective change program, we have an open enrollment training simulation coming up March 13th and 14th, where you can actually design a change plan and see if you can get 60% buy-in. It's really fun. You can enroll online with Bridge Innovate, or join us for another webinar and part of our webinar podcast series. We're going to have all kinds of speakers coming up, from designing experiences with Luke Blading to leveraging learning and development with Jonna Van Thiel of Kenco. So check us out on the bridgeinnovate.com website under open enrollment. Glenda, thanks so much for joining us today. It's been a pleasure, as always, to see you. And we'll look forward to more insights from you at a later time. Thanks so much.
Have a great day.
You too. Bye.
Yeah. Bye-bye.